sure it's,
Yep.
you're good.
All set. Okay, we'll get going on time. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Good, and I'm the president and CEO of Trevi. And it's really fun to see all our New Haven colleagues here, so thanks for coming. We all sort of run across each other, but it's nice to see us tell our stories. For those of you that don't know, I'm not just a president and CEO. I was also one of two crazy fools that was the founder of the company and wrote checks and spent 10 years begging for money. So the venture panel you just rang true. So it was a lot of fun to listen to. But we've sort of made it. We're a publicly traded company. We've put up some good data, you'll see. So what we wanted to try to do today is not only just give you a little bit of background on Trevi, but also we've brought one of the KOL thought leaders in the space that we're focused on. He'll give you an amazing view of sort of what's going on here. We've heard him talk a few times and I learn something every time. Farrell, Simon, I brought our commercial colleague, then we'll also talk a bit about the patients, the payers, the markets, and how we turn this all into a real business. So we're gonna talk for about an hour, and then at the end, we're happy to answer any questions you have. So thanks again for coming. Okay, so I mentioned I'm going to kick off. Peter Dicpinigaitis is our KOL that's here, and I'll introduce him when he comes up, and then Farrell will join me on the commercial side. So we just came off really an amazing 2022, and for those of you, I see some of my executive women and bio colleagues here. There was a time before that when I was sweating bullets and so worried about the readouts, and would Trevi be around a year from now to sort of tell its story. Well, fortunately, both of our indications turned up positive, so it was a really nice time. We were able to raise last year about $120 million. As you know, it's been a tough time to raise money in the market, so we are well capitalized and springboarding off two different positive trials. Coming out of that data, we did choose as a company to focus in on severe chronic cough conditions, and it's why we've brought Dr. Dicpinigaitis today to talk more about that. We also had a parallel trial. Canal was our cough data, and I'm going to show you just a few slides on the data. We also were running a trial called PRISM, which is a severe pruritus condition. And there's been a lot of thoughts that pain and itch and cough are all very intertwined. They're sort of different versions of the same thing. And I'll talk a bit about our mechanism, and we've actually been able to sort of connect the three dots. So PN is still an important asset for us. We are going to get through our FDA end of phase 2 meeting, and then we're active in partnership discussions. But as a company, we're going to build out a business around cough. So that's sort of our path forward. This is really the strategy slide when we started the company of what were we trying to do. So I just want to explain it a bit to you because it's a great springboard into what Dr. Dicpinigaitis is going to talk about. So our drug is a drug called nalbuphine ER. The trade name we use is Haduvio. It's broadly in the opioid class, which makes everyone want to run for the hills. But not all opioids are the same. And this subcategory of opioids is what's called mixed agonist-antagonists. It was actually developed in the 80s to deal with drug addiction. So you can see on the right side of this, or the left side of this slide, there's actually 4 opioid receptors, but 2 that are generally active. And when you think about things in the opioid crisis, like fentanyl, like morphine, like oxycodone, those are all mu agonists. So mu agonists have this likability and addiction potential associated with them. They also have great efficacy and good long-term safety, which is why people kept using them. What's interesting about this mixed agonist-antagonist class of drugs is we actually block that mu receptor. So if you think of things like naloxone, Suboxone, they're blocking that receptor, and we agonize at the kappa receptor. So the drug is not scheduled by the DEA. We've actually had it in 1,000 people, have not seen issues with it. We're in the midst of running sort of the final human abuse liability study. But when Tom and I started the company, we were really interested in exploring this class of drugs, but getting rid of the whole baggage that sort of plagued this class. So that was sort of the hypothesis. My co-founder is a neurologist. His particular interest, when you slide over to the right side of this chart, is around the body. And we've highlighted here where the endogenous opioid system is active in the body. So the center part of the brain stem, which mediates coughing and breathing. So it's a central component that's important. The lungs and peripheral nerves in the lung are rich in opioid receptors, as well as the skin and peripheral nerves in the skin. So you can see from that sort of body chart why we looked at cough and why we looked at pruritus. That was sort of the underpinning of what we were doing. So So our data we reported out last year in cough, this was a phase 2 trial, proof of concept. We called it CANAL. It was a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled 2 treatment period crossover study. So there were roughly 40 patients. They randomized in on drug or placebo. We titrated them up across our dose range for 3 weeks, washed them out, and then crossed them over. The primary endpoint is that little monitor you see on the right, which is an objective cough monitor. It's put on the patient. It actually measures the number of coughs. And so the primary endpoint's a mean change in your number of coughs. We did also look at a lot of other patient-reported outcomes, which you'll see all lined up and were all statistically significant as well. So these are the baseline characteristics. On the left, I mentioned we had just under 40 subjects enrolled. The mean age, the population looked a lot like what you see in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and I should just take a minute to speak about the disease. IPF is a end-of-life disease, typical lifespan of about 3 to 5 years from a diagnosis. It's a scarring in the lungs that is progressive. So one of the top 3 symptoms that these patients get is typically cough, breathlessness, and fatigue. So we are treating their most severe symptoms, and hopefully will have some kind of impact on the underlying disease. So that's the patient group we're focused on. These tend to be older males. You can see the mean age in this study was about 74 and about 84% men. There is a class of drugs that are used on these patients. They're called antifibrotics. I know Boehringer Ingelheim's running around at this conference. They have the lead asset that's been approved, lead drug, OFEV. It extends life from sort of this 3 to 5 to sort of roughly 5 to 7. It has not shown impact, though, on the underlying symptoms. And so we believe our drug will work nicely with these antifibrotics. So you can see in this study, we allowed people in that were on antifibrotics, and about half the patients were, half the patients weren't. We saw no difference in the treatment effect, so that's good for us. These people cough a lot, and Peter will give you a lot better sense of what these patients look like, but on average in our study we had about 28 per hour. But you can see below that ranged from 3 coughs per hour to 92 coughs per hour. I mean, that guy that had 92 coughed 1,500 times a day. So, you know, that's a real big problem for these people, very isolating. We also looked at 24-hour cough frequency, and you can see roughly the same numbers. About 90% of this cough happens in the daytime because it's a neurological cough, and that's important. We're not trying to treat productive coughs where there's something wet that the body's trying to, essentially move out. We are treating that neurological trigger that's going on with these diseases. You can see on the right sort of how people rolled through the study. I will say this was a tricky study to run because we were running it smack in the middle of COVID. So you can imagine IPF patients coming into centers and things. There were different times where we had to sort of quiet it down and kick everybody out and then re-enroll it again. So you'll sort of see some of the COVID flow through that. This is our primary endpoint. So the primary endpoint was daytime cough. Again, a reduction in cough, the number of coughs. You can see the drug is blue, placebo is orange. So we saw in the 3 weeks a 75% reduction in people's cough, which is really meaningful. Placebo was roughly 23%, which was in line with what had been seen in other studies in the space. I should mention other things have been looked at in IPF cough and have not worked. It's been a difficult condition. Matter of fact, we were given advice when we started, don't study IPF cough, it's too hard. But Tom was sort of adamant for his own biological reasons of wanting to do that. But this is the data we ended up with. And we also had a pre-specified endpoint of 24-hour cough. You can see it virtually the same story. This is probably my favorite slide of the data because not only did we get a big effect in this study, which you just saw, the 75%, you can see we broke this down by a responder analysis. So 30% is considered a clinically meaningful response. And what you can see, there's virtually every patient in our study responded in a clinically meaningful way. And when you slide over to the higher bar of 50%, 76% of the people in the study had their cough more than cut in half. And then the very high bar of 75%, you're still at almost half the subjects in the study. So very good effect. And you can see way down on the bottom right, the p-value here, it's less than 0.0001. And that's because it was a big drug effect that worked in almost everybody. So it was easy coming out of this study to know that efficacy probably had been established and we could sort of move on the rest of our way. So it's one thing to count individually coughs. There's a lot of other measurements of cough, and it's really important that just because your number of coughs goes down, the patient actually can feel that as well. So all the line charts here are patient-reported outcomes we took on a daily basis. So the upper left, you can see this was the patient's assessment of cough frequency. How many times did I cough today? The bottom left is cough severity. People may not cough so many times, but they may have really severe coughing attacks. The upper right is a breathlessness score, and then the bottom right is actually the clinician's assessment of the patient. And again, blue is drug, orange is placebo, and you can see that there's always statistical separation. I think the other thing that's important in these charts, we started these patients off at day 1 at our lowest dose of 27, and you can see we jumped them to 54, 108, and eventually up to the 162 milligram, which is the effective dose we've seen in our pruritus studies. But what you see here is the drug works very quickly. People start getting relief from day 1, basically, and it seems to work at very low doses. So you're going to see as I springboard into where are we going from this data. We've got to really go back and do a proper sort of interrogate that dose range on the lower end, because we suspect it's probably the low end of the dose range. I can't show you efficacy without showing you the other side of the coin, which is adverse events. You can see here these are typical, not only CNS active events, but opioids specifically. So nausea, fatigue, constipation, dizziness, somnolence, all things sort of the brain, the gut that you see with these drugs. I would say there's a couple hallmarks. They all tend to happen upon initiation of therapy, so the first week or 2. And then they tend to go away. They come and go pretty quickly. On average, they last about 3 to 5 days. So it's something we have to educate patients on and the sites that, hey, you may feel some of these. It's also, you can see we put the CTC grading criteria across the top, the 1, 2, 3. 1 and 2 is mild, moderate. So 95% of these tend to be mild, moderate, but, I don't want to feel nauseous at all. So it's important people understand this. We sort of work them through it, and then people do well. So where are we going next? We are moving into this phase 2B dose ranging study, and we're actively engaged in getting that up and started. We expect to start dosing that in the second half of this year. I mentioned we're looking at the low end of this dose range, 27, 54, 108 versus placebo. Fortunately, we can run a pretty short study. It's about 6 weeks. You saw the drug works very quickly, so we think in a short period of time, we'll be able to tease out what the difference is. I showed you before our study was this crossover design, which is typical in this cough space to do that first. This is now more of a parallel arm design, which will carry forward into our pivotal program. The endpoints look a lot like what you just saw. It's a reduction in cough as measured by the cough monitor, and then several other secondary endpoints as reported by the patient. So chronic cough is a big opportunity. So our lead is IPF chronic cough, which is what I just took you through. But chronic cough is a big, broad sort of gamish of things, and it's estimated to be about a $10 billion market. It's also, Peter, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think it's roughly estimated that 10 to 12% of the population will have chronic cough at some point in their life. When you look at sort of all these different buckets, where Trevi plans to focus, so I mentioned the IPF chronic cough in the bottom left. There's a broader category that IPF sits within. It's interstitial lung diseases. So once we sort out the dose, we will also look at cough and other interstitial lung diseases. And then I'm going to show you a slide. The other study we're going to run the second half of this year is refractory chronic cough. And both Peter and Farrell will spend a lot of time talking about that market. There's a lot of patients, and so where we play in that and how that lives with IPF cough, which is more of an orphan disease, is something that we need to be thoughtful about as we move our way through this. But that's sort of our market and how we're going to build out. So refractory chronic cough, and this is my last slide. This is a study we're also gearing up to start in the third quarter. It looks just like the design I just showed you. It's a crossover design. It's roughly 60 patients. We're going to run this in the UK and Canada, and you can see very similar to what you just saw, although we're going to go to the lower end of the doses and measure this. This will open up that other box that I showed you of a refractory chronic cough opportunity. So that's why we're running this, to show if the drug, and I think there's an important question here, and part of why we wanted Dr. Dicpinigaitis to come to speak is we've had the question a lot, just because you had good data in IPF cough, do you think that will translate into refractory chronic cough? Are they the same mechanisms? Because we know things that were studied in refractory chronic cough did not work in IPF cough. So that's part of what we're trying to bridge here, and I think part of what you'll address in your talk as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to the expert. Peter's very distinguished. He's a professor of medicine at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, critical care doc, runs a very large cough center, and we were at a medical meeting together last week, and he said something to me that was interesting, which is the worst of the worst coughers when they have nowhere else to go. There's only about 5 of these physicians sort of between here and Europe that treat most of these patients. So really kind of a labor of love, I think, dealing with them. And he's also the editor-in-chief of Lung, which is a very prestigious magazine. So we're really happy that he made the journey up to share some of this with you as well today. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you folks. So as Jennifer said, I come from down south in the Bronx. And it's great for me to be here to give you guys the patient and physician perspective. You know, you'll see a lot of graphs and figures at this meeting, but let's kind of give it a real world feeling as well. So what's the big deal about cough, right? It's not really that big a deal, is it? Well, every few years, the United States Department of Health and Human Services does a survey asking, why do people in the United States go to the doctor? And the last several surveys have always had the same results, and that is that cough is the single most common complaint for which folks in the United States seek medical attention. Right? It's not number 3, it's not number 7, it's always number 1. 16 to 30 million visits a year, depending on which database you look at. And we'll look in a moment at how we break up cough. But just to bring it a step back, certainly it's important on a macro scale, but to get back to the folks I see, and as Jennifer mentioned, I run a dedicated cough center. In fact, in March of this year, we celebrated our 20th anniversary, so I've been seeing these folks for 20 years. Cough's interesting because we've all had it. Okay, somebody can talk about IPF in this room and it's like, well, that's interesting, but we can't relate. But we've all had cough, okay? And you know how annoying it is to have a cold and to cough, let's say, one day. And you're at work, you're on the phone, you're trying to have a conversation, you're coughing, you're on the bus or the subway. Even pre-COVID, that was a disaster. You can imagine what's going on now, right? The folks I see, it's very typical for me to see somebody who's been coughing every single day for 10 years, 20 years. They haven't been to a restaurant or a concert or to church in 20 years for fear that one of these cough paroxysms is going to go on and bring attention to themselves. So these folks become shut-ins, okay? They become depressed. In fact, we did a study at our place showing that 53% of the folks coming to see us at the cough center test positive on a clinical depression scale. Wasn't surprising to me, but I wanted to do the study to get it out there. Because not only do lay folks, but even physicians underestimate the toll of cough. So you can't underestimate the effect of cough. But it's not only the patient, it's the spouse, family members, coworkers. There's a whole network involved with this, what could be really a life-destroying situation. So as physicians, we sort cough by duration, okay, acute, subacute, chronic. Because when we meet a patient, depending how long the cough's been there, it informs us as to what the probable or potential causes will be. So acute cough means you've had a cough for less than 3 weeks, and almost all acute cough is due to common cold, and that's the one that I'm sure everyone in this room has had. Subacute cough we call a cough that's been around for 3 to 8 weeks, and usually that cough is just an acute viral cough that lingers. Once you've had a cough for more than 8 weeks, then we call that chronic cough. And again, definitions are important because we're going to talk about studies. The definition of a chronic cough simply means that you've had a cough for 8 weeks. Once you've had a cough for 8 weeks, that it becomes much more likely that you have your cough not due to the residual of a cold, but because of some underlying condition that the doctor has to diagnose and treat and make the cough go away. And in the United States, the majority of chronic cough is due to one or more of 3 things. And one is what layman's terms is postnasal drip. We call it upper airway cough syndrome. Number 2 is asthma and asthma-like conditions. And number 3 is acid reflux. Obviously, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis is in the chronic cough category because these folks obviously have chronic cough, but it would be a distinct category. So this is a paradigm we've physicians have been following for decades. Now, it's very important to understand that when a physician sees a person with chronic cough in the office, right, our job is not to suppress the cough. Right, our job is not to say, hey, this new drug just got approved yesterday by FDA, here you go. The physician's job when they meet a patient with chronic cough is to do a very thorough evaluation, looking for underlying treatable causes of that cough, treat that underlying reversible cause of the cough, and make the cough go away. That's the goal, if possible. So, again, if we have somebody who's not a smoker, not on an ACE inhibitor medicine, which is really the only drug class that actually causes cough, and doesn't have any active disease on X-ray, it's most likely that that cough is due to one or more of these three baskets of things. So, important point, chronic cough, look for the underlying cause, don't run to suppress the cough. This slide is easily the topic of an entire lecture, and for me, I would spend half an hour on this if I was giving a lecture to my colleagues, but this slide is just to make the point that when we have somebody with chronic cough, we have to do a very thorough, stepwise evaluation with empiric treatment trials aimed at these known common underlying causes of cough, treat those causes empirically and see whether the cough gets better or not. And you'll see a whole list of things. So the workup for chronic cough can take months, because each of these can take, well, upper airway cough, at least a 2-week trial, asthma, at least a 2-week trial, for reflux, at least a 2-month trial. So the workup takes a while before we even think about using a cough suppressant. Unfortunately, it's often the case that we do this very thorough workup and nothing works. So what do we do then? So when I give this talk to my colleagues, I say, you really don't want to get to this slide. That's why you have to do such a thorough job looking for an underlying cause. But if you don't, then, and only then, can we use the term refractory chronic cough, all right? Refractory chronic cough is a chronic cough, more than 8 weeks, that has not responded to adequate and appropriate therapy for all underlying treatable causes. The reason it's important is that you'll see on almost all of the pipeline cough drugs now in development, the indication is RCC, refractory chronic cough. Some are IPF, but the majority of the drug pipeline drugs are for refractory chronic cough. So that's why it's very important to be familiar with the definition. Now, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF, is another distinct cause of chronic cough. But it's been known for decades that the two things that IPF folks complain about most is cough and shortness of breath. One seminal study done many years ago showed that 85% of IPF folks have a significant troublesome cough. Just last year, end of 22, a very interesting study showing that people with interstitial lung disease, which is the broader term into which IPF fits, their cough-specific quality of life was independently associated with hospitalization, death, and need for lung transplantation in these patients with IPF. So cough was a very important marker. Whether it's associative or causative is another issue. So we talked about how you want to avoid getting to the point of needing to treat refractory chronic cough, but unfortunately we do. And in the hands of those of us that have chronic cough centers, our experience is that probably about 40% of the folks that come see us are still left with an untreatable refractory chronic cough even after we go through this very thorough workup. So what do we do for refractory chronic cough? What do we have available to us now in 2023? So this is the audience participation segment of my talk. When was the last cough drug approved by FDA? Anybody want to venture a guess? 1996, right? Do we have anyone more cynical in the audience to shout out another guess? All right. So it was a bit ago. It was 1958 was the last drug approved by FDA. And extra credit, the answer is benzonatate, Tessalon pearls, those little yellow gel caps that they're prescription, but docs use them a lot. A very nice looking drug. But there's never been a drug approved for chronic cough in the history of the United States and in the history of most countries. There's never been a chronic cough drug approved. Benzonatate in 1958, the one before that, 1954, was dextromethorphan. So never a chronic cough drug in the United States. So since we don't have anything labeled, right? So we literally have no labeled drug for RCC to use. So we as physicians treating refractory chronic cough, our only options are off-label drugs. And this is the landscape. This is what we have. We have the mu agonist opioids that Jennifer alluded to, morphine, codeine, hydrocodone. Needless to say, for something that's probably going to require chronic therapy, not a very attractive option. I don't use mu opioid agonists. Most of my colleagues don't. So what we're left with is, my thing isn't working. All right, well, what we're left with is what we call the neuromodulators, which are two drugs, amitriptyline, which is an old antidepressant drug, and gabapentin. We use these drugs to try to actually suppress the cough reflex, because now we're in phase B, right? Phase A of cough is don't treat the cough, find the underlying cause, treat the underlying cause, and make the cough go away. Once you've failed in that and you have a diagnosis of RCC, then we segue to phase B, which is just suppress the cough and give these poor patients some symptomatic relief. So we use amitriptyline and gabapentin. In my experience, both of these have been have worked very poorly for me. Maybe 15% of patients do well with them. Because the issue with amitriptyline and gabapentin is that not only does the drug have to give you cough suppression, but the patient has to tolerate the dose of the drug they need to achieve that cough suppression. And especially with gabapentin, in my experience, the sedation is so heavy, so severe, it's intolerable. So even some folks that do get cough suppression cannot use gabapentin because they're just too sedated. And we've learned in the last decade that the speech-language pathologist, the speech therapist, can be a very useful additional tool to drugs, but there are very few out there that are expert in and interested in chronic cough. Well, IPF is in the same world, right? They have no indicated RCC drugs either, so doctors who are treating IPF patients with cough, just like the RCC patients, also are limited to this, unfortunately, ineffective menu of interventions that we have. So luckily, in the last 10 years, we've learned a lot about the mechanism of cough. And this is a nice figure that some of my friends published.
So you're down one, I think. That'll go to the next slide. Are you trying to highlight?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I thought it was this. It worked before. That's all right. I'll use my incredible speaking skills to explain it. So this is just a beautiful summary of how much we've learned about cough in the last 10 years. So the top line is, what triggers the cough in the first place. It's usually viruses, even for chronic cough. And then we learned about what is the effect of viral and other insults on cells and tissues like mast cells, etc. And then these cells and tissues, when they get stimulated, release certain cytokines and other chemicals. And those cytokines and chemicals go off then and stimulate receptors and ion channels. And at the bottom line there, you see a nerve terminal in the peripheral airway showing all the different potential receptors and ion channels that, when stimulated, can cause cough. So when you find a receptor or an ion channel that is relevant to the induction of cough, then you can go out and ask folks to find antagonists or agonists to these relevant receptors. And that's why, because of all these learnings in terms of cough mechanism, which is why we've gone from having no pipeline programs maybe 15 years ago to now having a whole bunch of pipeline programs nowadays. And we'll talk about specifically some of these receptors and ion channels that you see at the bottom of the slide. So this is a summary of what's going on right now. I may have missed one or two, but there's 7 programs that I can think of going on in terms of looking for drugs for chronic cough. So just to give you a bit of an update. So if I was giving this talk 10 years ago, I would have said the TRPV1 antagonist would definitely have been the first cough drug ever approved. Unfortunately, on paper in the lab, they should have worked. They did not. So after multiple disappointing negative trials with TRPV1 antagonists, those are pretty much off the table. But there's an associated receptor called TRPA1, and there are at least a couple of phase 2 studies going on looking at TRPA1. So the TRP family of receptors is still in play. By far the most active area and furthest along are the P2X3 antagonists, and some of you folks may be familiar with that. You know that Merck, that has gefapixant, has already completed phase 3 studies. We were anticipating approval of gefapixant in early 2022. FDA had a different opinion. They gave a CRL, but not because of anything to do with the drug, but purely because of the way objectively cough was counted in that study. So we're still waiting for approval of that, I hope. Bellis, meanwhile, started their phase 3 of their P2X3 antagonist just this past January, so they have started. Now, the P2X3 antagonist space used to be a 4-horse race, but since 2022, 2 and 1 just more recently, 2 programs have discontinued. So Bayer had a P2X3 antagonist that actually had a positive phase 2b study, and we were quite eager to learn more about this drug. Unfortunately, Bayer pulled it because of a few liver function test abnormalities that gave them pause, and they chose not to continue the program. And more recently, Shionogi had their own P2X3 antagonist named sibepixant. They had a positive phase 2a study, surprisingly a negative phase 2b study. Based on that, they chose not to pursue. So the P2X3 space for now are these 2 programs well along. There's another group of drugs called the neurokinin 1 antagonists. At this point, I'm aware of only one in development by the company called Nere. They're an Irish company, but they're looking at exclusively IPF cough, not RCC. There's another company named Exalbion. They're looking at a TRPM8 agonist. That's another one of the receptors that I showed in that figure. They just had a small phase 2a pilot proof of concept study that was positive, so they're planning a phase 2b to flesh that out a little more. Another interesting area is these drugs called voltage-gated sodium channel blockers. The company Nocion has been involved in that for years. We haven't heard anything from Nocion recently. They will be giving an update on their program at next week's American Cough Conference, so we're all interested to see what they've been up to and what their plans are. Maybe the newest program is out of a company in Vancouver named Algernon, and they're looking at a drug called ifenprotil, which is not a new drug. It's been out for decades for other indications in Japan, South Korea. They also had a small proof of concept study in IPF, positive, and they are now planning a study, I believe, later in the year, but looking at RCC, not IPF. And then, of course, you've heard about nalbuphine, that I'm very happy to hear that these folks are going to look at IPF and RCC. So one question, we looked at the graph I showed you with all the different receptors out in the periphery of the lung that may be involved in cough. So the question for someone who's developing a cough drug is, well, is it better to have a cough drug that blocks cough centrally or peripherally? So when you look again at this figure, and if you look at the bottom there with the receptors, the P2X receptor you see there in orange, that's been a key focus. I mentioned TRPA1 over there in blue, that's being looked at right now. But if you think about it, if somebody's cough is due to the fact that ATP is stimulating a P2X3 receptor and causing cough, then that person's cough will be improved perhaps by a drug that specifically blocks the P2X3 antagonist, like the drugs we just mentioned. But there's no doubt that chronic cough is a very heterogeneous entity, right? There are a lot of different receptors and ion channels that can get tickled out there to start that afferent neural mechanism to cause cough. So, not surprisingly, every one of these phase 2 studies showed a very large non-responder rate. I mean, why wouldn't it? Because just like other medical entities, one drug isn't going to work for everything, and here we understand the mechanism. So if your patient's cough is due to a P2X3 relevant mechanism, they may get better from a P2X3 antagonist. If not, then that drug likely wouldn't work. So let's think about the cough reflex. All right? In very simple terms, cough is a very simple reflex. The signal to cause a cough starts in the lung by one of these ion channels or receptors being stimulated. And then there's a signal that goes via the vagus nerve to the brainstem to tell the brain to induce a cough. So if you're at the periphery and looking to block one of the many possible receptors that can trigger that channel, then if you have a drug that's targeted to that patient's specific reason for cough, it may work. But if you hit the cough centrally, meaning you block the cough at the level of the brainstem, then that drug is going to be agnostic to whether it was a P2X3 receptor stimulated, whether it was a TRPA1 channel stimulated, whether it was a neurokinin 1. That cough will be suppressed proximally at the level of the brainstem. So presumably, there should be much broader coverage and cough suppression regardless of which of the many peripheral mechanisms may have started the cough impulse in the first place. Right, so the central acting drug should suppress cough independent of the initiating trigger, right? Whereas the peripheral drug needs to be targeted to your patient. However, we have no way of a priori knowing whether my chronic cough patient's chronic cough is due to P2X3 stimulation, TRPA1 stimulation, and K1 stimulation. There's no way to know. We have no biomarkers. So for that reason, a centrally acting drug would be expected to be more efficacious. The problem is the centrally acting drugs we now have, which, as I mentioned, they're all non-label, have been riddled by the fact that, unfortunately, don't work very well, and the sedation's been terrible. As I mentioned, gabapentin, in my experience, has been terrible. Amitriptyline, less sedating, but not very effective. And the mu agonist opioids have their issues. So even though, in my opinion, a centrally acting cough-suppressing drug would be the most likely to be effective for the most number of patients, we don't yet have an acceptable drug to use. Talking about this peripheral central thing, especially specifically with IPF, there is precedent to show that drugs that work peripherally do not work for, let's say, IPF cough. Just to mention two. So the top one is the aforementioned gefapixant, which I think will be approved, hopefully this year or next, for RCC, refractory chronic cough. Didn't work in IPF cough. Again, not surprising to me. IPF cough is probably due to scar tissue being laid down in the lung. So why would simply blocking the P2X3 make that cough go away? Okay, so I would have predicted this before it happened. And then there was another study done of an inhaled drug called cromolyn. Again, gets deep into the airways, probably good for asthma, probably good for other things. Also failed in IPF cough. Again, it's a peripherally acting drug. So to summarize, there's a great unmet need all around. Certainly for IPF cough, ILD cough, there are a lot of suffering patients. The number of sufferers, though, is much larger in the refractory chronic cough group than there is for IPF. So obviously we need drugs for both, but RCC a bigger number, and I'm very happy to see that we have multiple pipeline drugs now going on in RCC. So with the remarkable data with CANAL and what Jennifer showed before with the 75% reduction of cough count, we've never seen such a thing in other studies. And those are RCC studies. IPF has been shown to be even a tougher nut to crack in terms of bringing down numbers. So these numbers really are remarkable based on what else we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years. So again, since it acts centrally, and since Trevi started with the harder target IPF and came up with that kind of number, it certainly seems to me that I would expect it to work with RCC. And I'm really looking forward to the data that hopefully will come out sooner than later. So I think that's all I have. Thanks for having me, and we'll take questions at the end. And I will introduce Farrell Simon to get down to some of the business end of this stuff.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Farrell Simon, Chief Commercial Officer at Trevi. And what I hope to get across today is what is the opportunity across these indications? Because I think as Jennifer and Dr. Dicpinigaitis showed here, there's a broad range of cough and there's a broad range of opportunity here. We showed very remarkable data within this idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis subset that lives within a broader interstitial lung disease category. And as we progress through clinical development, as Jennifer alluded to earlier, once we know our dose in IPF, should translate well into this interstitial lung diseases. These patients are treated similarly, guidelines are developed similarly against these therapies, and so we see a large success as we expand that population as a quick win from the IPF population. I think there's one intricacy that does make us different from the antifibrotics that are out there on the market. Antifibrotics need a progressive type of disease in order to show a difference in lung function over time. And that's what they showed within IPF, but also the broader ILD category. Cough presents itself regardless of whether or not the underlying disease state in ILDs is progressive. And so that opens up a broader patient population for us to potentially impact and improve. And then I think separately, this refractory chronic cough space. It's really consolidated around refractory chronic cough. I think unexplained chronic cough has been a term that is not as well utilized, but it's these three main conditions: acid reflux or GERD, asthma, postnasal drip. If you're treated maximally on underlying therapy to treat the underlying condition, a lot of these patients still have that underlying cough. And I'll show you what those numbers look like and where we have a unique opportunity within that population. So we did our own market research to elucidate what are the opportunities within these three categories. As we look across physicians, so we surveyed pulmonologists as well as primary care physicians. And just to acquaint you to the scale, the teal color that you see is very low on the scale. The dark blue color is very high on that scale. And we asked them across three separate measures. What do you see in terms of the unmet need? What do you see in terms of the impact on quality of life? And then the urgency and the importance of treating these patients. And you see a sea of really sameness well across all three of these and across all subtypes of cough. You know, physicians clearly see an unmet need across all these conditions. IPF is one that presents because of the terminal nature of the disease, likely raises the importance of treating that cough, but it's not that dissimilar to those within ILDs or those within the refractory chronic cough category. And I think Dr. Dicpinigaitis did a nice job going through the competitive landscape. He took you through the trial results across a number of these areas. But what it does go to show is what is the opportunity we have to be a first-in-class and potentially best-in-class therapy within IPF chronic cough. We do see P2X3s leading the way within refractory chronic cough space, and I think their approval actually helps the path forward in terms of development and progress. But when you look at the P2X3 mechanism within refractory chronic cough, you know, and you look at their results are a little bit like a dimmer switch on cough. There's a lower response rate than what we saw within our phase 2A data. And not only is there a lower response rate on the clinical meaningfulness of the results, but when you do get a response, you're seeing reductions of 40, 50%. And so there's an unmet need even within that group. We'll go into more detail about some failures within that group that don't reach the level of response in which they need to achieve in order to claim success. And that presents even further opportunity for us within the RCC category. So this just goes to show what is the patient populations within these groups, but really what is the addressable patient population that Haduvio uniquely has within each of these. Within IPF presents itself, I'll go into a little bit more about the patient population and the patient unmet need here. But you have about 140,000 prevalent population within the US. And for the majority of this presentation, we'll talk about US numbers. Up to 85% of them present with chronic cough. But somewhere between 70 to 85% of those patients not only present with chronic cough, but they have a chronic cough that is debilitating and needs treatment despite using other off-label therapies. So this yields about 100,000 patients within IPF that have already been treated with other therapies and have failed those therapies and are ready to be treated with a new mechanism. Non-IPF ILDs, so it's that other subset, a very heterogeneous population. This roughly doubles that population, right? So you see about 90,000 patients here that do present with chronic cough. Similarly, they have been treated already and would be available as treated population upon a potential approval. And then over to the right side, you see this refractory chronic cough population. And I think the balance between refractory chronic cough and these more orphan disease states, as Jennifer alluded to earlier, is this is a very large population. But when you start digging into this population in terms of those presenting to pulmonologists, where we'll already be within IPF and ILDs, and those continue to be uncontrolled on prior mechanisms, you could see upwards of about 500,000. So this starts to really de-risk the payer environment and provides us the potential to maintain favorable pricing with that of these orphan disease states in pulmonary fibrosis broadly. So we'll walk through each of these categories. IPF, I think you saw a lot of these numbers as we went through this presentation, but 140,000 prevalent population. There also is an increasing incident population of 30 to 40,000 patients diagnosed with IPF each year. And I think one of the uniquenesses that we saw coming out of the American Thoracic Society conference last weekend is, I think it was traditionally thought as patients progress throughout their disease, their cough worsens. And I think some recent data out of registry data really elucidated that there is a subset of patients that have moderate to severe cough, that present with moderate to severe cough, and they likely stick with that phenotype throughout their entire cough progression. And so these patients are physically, psychologically, and socially impacted from cough even before they even receive a diagnosis. And so this is thought of as part of the critical disease management that needs to occur in terms of diagnosing IPF properly, getting that early diagnosis in a terminal disease state, but then also treating the whole patient. Because when you think about the role that cough can play within an IPF patient uniquely, we talked about the hypothesis, if someone's coughing 1,500 times in a day, and just imagine that number, the trauma that causes on the lungs, the repetitive trauma day in and day out, that may lead to pro-fibrotic mechanisms. It may lead to a worsening of disease states. And we'll look at that in future trials over time. But what a closer in hypothesis is, how does that impact their health outcomes? And I think as Dr. Dicpinigaitis talked about, potentially increasing the rate of respiratory hospitalizations, mortality, lung transplant. These are more tangible outcomes that may be able to be seen in a shorter, call it, than a 52-week trial. Cough also plays a role in terms of what these patients are able to do. And so whether they're homebound, whether they isolate, especially in a post-COVID or a COVID environment, cough is at the center of a wheel of these patients' lives. They go through pulmonary rehabilitation, they're urged to get exercise, they're urged to really get back to activity that could help their lung function. But in a lot of instances, they're unable to do that because how much chronic cough limits their ability to function. And so we went through a little bit about the treatment algorithm. What is available to physicians and pulmonologists within this space, and how do they sequence these therapies, and what is the average success rate on these therapies? What I'll call out here is, as physicians progress, they start off with Tessalon pearls, I think as Dr. Dicpinigaitis, alluded to. Monotherapy is, typically a first-line therapy. They progress to combination therapies with whatever they have available. But right now, it's a test and see approach. It's a 2-week trial of this and a 2-week trial of that before they can definitively claim success or failure on these therapies. And you see all those, I think, therapies that were mentioned previously about Tessalon pearls, proton pump inhibitors, codeine, morphine, opioid mu agonists within this space that also carry some potential safety and tolerability concerns. What I'll mention is when we talk about guidelines and what do treatment guidelines recommend to these patients, unless IPF patients have underlying acid reflux, which many of them do, but when it's treated, PPIs are not indicated. So that's proton pump inhibitors to reduce the acid. They're not indicated for treatment within an IPF population unless that patient has acid reflux. So therapies are being used in this space as a hit 'em and hope type of approach. And so from our market research, we talked to 100 pulmonologists within the US and asked them what their perceived efficacy, safety, and tolerability profile. So to orient you, on the left-hand side of this slide is their perceived level of efficacy across these current off-label therapies. And on the right-hand side is the perceived level of safety and tolerability, with teal being not that safe or tolerable. And from the current therapies out there, what you see is success rates ranging from 9 to 25%, but that mimics placebo rates within this category, right? You're not really getting anything more than a placebo response out of these therapies. The one that shows a better placebo rate, a better rate than placebo is codeine and morphine, these mu agonists that we know work centrally, but that also comes with a level of safety and tolerability concerns. And so when we showed them the target product profile of Haduvio, based on these phase 2A results that Jennifer took you through, you see a favorable perceived benefit on efficacy and a favorable safety and tolerability profile. So I'll transition to the non-IPF ILD category. The question that typically comes up is, well, how do these patients present with cough? IPF is very well characterized, very well understood in terms of the role of cough, the prevalence of cough within this patient population. But when you start getting down to the subtypes of cough in these non-IPF populations, you do see these patients present with similar rates of cough. And so this just goes to show that patient opportunity of that 90,000 US patients with ILDs do have that unmet need. And what's being used within this? It's not surprising that similar therapies are being used within this patient population and to the similar rate of efficacy. Roughly 26% see a moderate to very successful benefit. And so there's a significant portion and unmet need from these therapies and remaining need from treated therapies. And not much has been studied in this space. And I think as we showed the pipeline slide, the refractory chronic cough space, the IPF space, has pipeline developments. But nothing is being studied within this interstitial lung disease space. And it's an important space to help move the needle. They are treated with antifibrotics. Antifibrotics do help extend potentially their lives within this space. But what they don't necessarily do is improve the quality of that life. And so as one of our other KOLs has stated, these patients live a 3 to 5 year crappy life. And what antifibrotics do is they extend that life, but unfortunately it leads to a 5 to 7 year crummy life. And so we have an opportunity to really improve these patients' quality of life. And when we showed that similar target product profile, and I think it was great, as the panel and VCs said earlier, really understanding what you're striving for and really understanding how that your asset is being positioned. When we showed this to them, 63% were favorable on prescribing Haduvio to this patient population. And what I think is equally as impactful here is the number of patients they see in the last 12 months. So patients are not only available, but they're in the right practices. They're being seen by the right specialists. And so they see 64 patients over the last 12 months. And so these patients are present. They have not, resigned to the fact of their disease state and not showing up to those specialist office, which is an important point when we get to the shape of the curve of a launch. So this is the last category in terms of refractory chronic cough, which is a budding space in terms of the pipeline. I think as Dr. Dicpinigaitis showed, P2X3 mechanisms, some of them have shown success here. We hope they do get approved. This is an important asset for these patients. But when we look at this patient population, these patients cough equally to that of the IPF population, and their impact on quality of life is correlated to their level of cough and the level of cough frequency here. This is a survey we didn't conduct, but we're lucky enough to collaborate and get the data. But this is a patient survey of 1,000 patients with chronic cough. And this is refractory chronic cough to those 3 conditions, GERD, postnasal drip, as well as asthma. But what role can we play as Haduvio within this population? And our orphan disease states within IPF and ILDs, we're going to be focused on the pulmonologist office. That's where we can drive efficiencies in a model, but that's where we can approach the most difficult to treat chronic cough patients. Once they reach the level of a pulmonologist, they have already failed multiple therapies. But 18% of the refractory chronic cough market, although it's wide in terms of 1.8 million patients, 18% are presenting to a pulmonologist. And most of these patients, 86% of them are uncontrolled, on whatever off-label therapies are there today. And so how bothersome, what is the patient profile that does present to these patients? And not shockingly, the frequency of chronic cough, once again, 85% of them say they cough constantly or several times per day. And so that is a prime prospect. These are the right patients presenting to the right place who have already failed other therapy and will be available at launch. And then how bothersome? I think it's 95% say it's very bothersome or somewhat bothersome cough. And this is going to be expected from the payer environment, right? With a 1.8 million patient population, payers are scared about risk. And one way to do that is really narrow and focus down into who needs this therapy the most. And this is the most severe population, and we think we have them in the right places. And so this is just off-label therapy, similar story. I won't belabor the point that on the right-hand side you see how are current therapies viewed. They're viewed as safe, but largely they're also viewed as ineffective against improving quality of life and ineffective therapies in terms of reducing cough counts. So when we showed our target product profile within this patient population, we saw a similar result of 58% wanting to adopt and prescribe this to their patients. So it brings back to the patient opportunity with Haduvio. These are patients in need. These patients, once again, have physical, psychological, social impacts across all of these chronic cough disease states. And we think that they're already there in terms of an addressable patient population, having failed other therapies and being presented to a pulmonologist. And so just a couple other points to make in terms of where would we be used within the lines of therapy. So when we surveyed our pulmonologists and primary care physicians, second-line therapy after failing these cough therapies rose up to the top, along with first. Because when you're talking about the most severe populations, you're talking about an IPF patient population, they rely on something that wants to work across a broad range of patients and work to a large extent, right? They don't want to go through this trial and error. And I think Dr. Dicpinigaitis can talk to that effect within the refractory chronic cough world. And lastly, what does the shape of the curve look like? And so this is quite similar across all three cough indications with a rapid uptake and a time to peak of roughly 2 years. And so when you look at the potential Haduvio has within this patient population, there's a large remaining unmet need across all three of these. The majority of cough patients are uncontrolled, specifically those presenting to a pulmonologist office, which does streamline the commercial model, but it also helps maintain, we think, favorable pricing across these indications. We think we're differentiated in terms of our central mechanism of action, and then we could be used in terms of first and second line therapy. And lastly, the potential for rapid adoption by pulmonologists, but also patients are waiting at the end of this journey. They're in need, and we think we can fill that gap. So with that, I'll hand it back to Jennifer for closing remarks.
Farrell, that was so well done, but I have to teach you what the color teal looks like. That was sky blue. Typical man, throwing out colors. I think my last slide here, just to wrap this up, and we're sort of right on our hour, is just what's Trevi's path forward. So I mentioned IPF chronic cough. We're initiating that dose-ranging study I showed you. We'll get that going in the second half. Probably takes roughly 12 months to enroll that study. So somewhere late next year, we're hoping to have data. We're also running another safety study in conjunction with that around opioids are known to have respiratory depression. We have not seen it with our drug. Actually, these mixed agonist-antagonists, there's literature that hypothesizes that's not an issue. But because of the sick nature of these patients and sort of the respiratory impairment, it's an important study for us to nail down. So we're also in the midst of starting that study. We'll wrap up our prurigo nodularis. We've just gotten all the open label data. We'll get back to the FDA and then look forward as if there's to see if there's a deal there for us to do. And I mentioned this whole abuse and addiction question. We've gathered a lot of data on that. As I mentioned, the DEA has already unscheduled this drug, at least in a sub-Q injection form. We are running sort of the final study there around human abuse potential to hopefully put that to rest. So that study's been initiated, and we'll get data by the end of this year. And in closing, the heartbeat of any good biotech company is having enough capital to do it. So we, as of the end of March, had roughly $111 million, and we've got cash runway that we expect gets us into 2026. So this whole plan I show you here should be finished by the end of 2024, which leaves us with 12 to 18 months of cash on the backside. So another sort of important concept. Otherwise, in our world, you report good data, everyone assumes you got to raise money, and people wait for the raise so your stock doesn't actually trade up. So we hope we've sort of laid this out that if the data is positive, we can actually see some good stock appreciation. So with that, I will ask my two colleagues to join me back up here, and happy to answer questions. We also will be here for a little after if you guys would rather come up and ask them one-on-one, but I'll open it up if there's any questions. Yes, please. Oh, hey, Gabe.
Hi.
Didn't see you there.
Great job, guys. How do you expect the treatment landscape to change for chronic cough when the P2X3s are approved?
Peter, I'm going to give you this.
Is this working? Great.
Yep.
Right, so as I said, we were anticipating gefapixant to be approved in January 22. So all of us were telling our patients since 2020, just wait till spring of 22 and you'll have a drug. And now, we all look like idiots trying to explain why, the monitor was an issue. But since we have zero good therapy for RCC, I think the day gefapixant gets approved, or the first one, it'll be appropriate for 100% of all RCC patients. Now, in my opinion, the P2X3s probably won't be effective or tolerated for maybe more than 50% of patients. But in the 20, 30, 40 for whom, let's say, you get good cough suppression and you tolerate because the P2X3s have this very interesting taste effect, it'll be life-changing for a percentage of patients. In my opinion, it'll be a minority. But I think, as Farrell mentioned, these aren't lights-out drugs either, the P2X3s. Your cough goes from 50 coughs an hour to 30 coughs an hour, 70 coughs an hour to 25. So these aren't lights-out drugs. So they'll be better because compared to nothing, anything is better than nothing. But just like with any other medical entity, we're going to need multiple molecules out there, right? We don't have one blood pressure drug out there. We have 15. We don't have one diabetes or HIV drug. We have a bunch. So if you talk about peripherals, we'll definitely need multiple peripherals. The central is the one that might cover more of that landscape.
Then just a second question. In terms of the market opportunity, the revenue build, you had like 150 to 200,000 patients that could use your drug after they failed on P2X3s. And I'm wondering, is that feels like an underestimate to me relative to the taste loss issue that you're seeing? And in the real world, outside of a controlled clinical trial setting, is taste loss going to be even more of an issue? I'm just curious how you got to 150 to 200.
So when you look at, there's two populations, right, within the refractory chronic cough. One are those that present with a severe cough from the onset, right? I think those are eligible patients as well. I think the second are these P2X3 failures. So it's really failures of other mechanisms in a second line setting so that we can ensure that the main thing is ensuring favorable pricing across the RCC category to IPF and ILDs. And if we open ourselves up to all of the 1.8 million patients within RCC, I think there's a challenge in terms of price erosion. And so it's de-risking the payers, being very focused about that severe population, which is not just the P2X3 failures, but this severe population, in order to help mitigate that price erosion.
Thank you, Gabe.
I'm sorry, if I could just tune in. So I think we don't need to think about P2X3 failures as candidates for other drugs. A P2X3 success can be somebody who has a 50% cough reduction, which is good compared to zero cough reduction. But if that brings you from 60 coughs an hour to 30, the patient is happy that they're at 30, not at 60, but it's still ruining their life, so they will be very eager for a second drug. So it's not P2X3 failures, it's the expected P2X3 partial successes, and if that partial success isn't enough, we as physicians will be looking for a second drug, just like we're doing, again, for blood pressure, pulmonary hypertension, diabetes, or whatnot.
I should mention Gabe was the banker that helped us raise all that money. So for any of you company execs here, be sure and run him down afterwards. Yep. Go ahead here.
I just wanted to ask about the lack of approval for therapies for RCC and for even IPF. Is this because of the FDA not being able to target a primary endpoint in terms of the quality of life in what they're looking for, or is it a mechanism of action that we just haven't been able to figure out yet? Or what are the, when I think about NASH and other diseases, it's kind of, go a long way in that FDA really kind of target a primary endpoint. Is that the same situation with RCC and IPF? And also in terms of the, approval of the drugs, are you competitively, we just not seeing any new mechanism of action come into market, and that could be the reason or the delay in getting new approvals?
So Peter, let me comment on the drug developer, and then I'd love you to comment on the mechanisms, because you've watched it sort of along the way, kind of your views maybe on the science. From a drug developer perspective, there's been a lot of work done, and that's thanks to Merck and sort of some of these refractory chronic cough to blaze the pathway in a primary endpoint, what the FDA needs to see. So we've been to the FDA. It's very clear what the primary endpoint was. They've given us good counsel sort of on what we're going to need to work our way through the program. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. I think there wasn't even agreement on the definition of what these patient groups were. But fortunately, we've been sort of able to learn from that parallel group of RCC and apply that in IPF cough. As far as why sort of the science, I think, hadn't caught up, I'll let Peter answer that question.
So I'll just speak from my experience. So, I've been working in cough in 25 years, so I went from no pipeline programs to, thankfully, a whole bunch of pipeline programs. And I've been an advisor to a bunch of companies, so I have sat at FDA meetings and heard what they had to say. So up until 15 years ago, there couldn't be any good studies published in the medical literature in cough because we had no validated objective endpoints and no validated subjective endpoints. So that was the problem. If you're checking a blood pressure drug, well, your blood pressure is either 122/82 or it's something else. If you have a diabetes drug, your blood sugar is either 115 or it's something else. With cough, that wasn't the case. So that was the first problem. There were no objective endpoints with which to do a scientifically valid study. And secondly, up until about 10, 15 years ago, it's now totally different. FDA's point of view was, well, cough's just a symptom, so it's not really a disease, so, why should we care? And my colleagues and I have spent the last 10 years trying to, get through the concept that RCC is not a symptom of something else. It's its own distinct medical entity of a neuropathic cough, and I think that is now accepted in those who are in the space. So those were the issues. So once we got the first ever FDA F10K approved or sanctioned, whatever the word is, cough monitor, the VitaloJAK, that's when studies started getting done, and also we now have at least 2 validated subjective instruments, right? Because cough is a symptom, so it's great if your cough frequency is 60 to 30 or 60 to 20, but if the patient says, I don't feel any better, then where does that leave you? So any company coming forth to FDA with a drug has to have a primary objective endpoint and 2 or 3 subjective endpoints. Gefapixant led the way, and a lot of the subsequent phase 2Bs have kind of copy and pasted that protocol. So at least now we have endpoints, and at least in my thinking, the FDA has become very receptive to companies coming in with novel mechanisms of action, and they seem to be embracing, and they want a drug to be approved. So I just hope that this Merck thing gets sorted out to FDA's satisfaction. And as I said on my slide, I think I had 7 pipeline programs going with 7 different molecules. And we need that because just with anything else, we're not going to get by with one molecule to treat cough. We're going to need a bunch of different drugs to work with. So that's my perspective.
Thank Yeah, Leland.
Oh, the question for Dr. Dicpinigaitis. Just want to explore further the central versus peripheral, and given the number of different receptors that are involved peripherally, do we know beyond kind of just empiric data on who responds and who doesn't to different classes of these agents, kind of what the participation of these receptors is in the population with respect to cough, or to what extent do we know that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, we don't have the answer. Right now, we have no biomarker for chronic cough. Folks are going to start working on it. We have no biomarker, so we have no way of knowing a priori whether this patient in my office is more likely to respond to a P2X3 or a TRPA1. We just don't have that insight at this point. What we do know is we have about a dozen phase 2 studies, let's say of gefapixant, where there was always a 30% non-responder rate. Again, why wouldn't there be? It's a heterogeneous group, in my opinion. So if you have a 30% non-responder in phase 2, then you go out in the real world, it'll probably be larger. Plus, you have to add on the folks that don't like the taste effect. And again, that's why I'm saying that we're going to need a second, third, and fourth option for our chronic cough patients, even after the first or second P2X3 gets approved.
Any final questions? None from the patent attorneys up there in the far right?
Do you want the question?
That's always my question. I can handle that. We have lots of patents, so that's an important area. Thank you for everybody coming. We really appreciate your time, and we'll be here for a little bit if you guys want to wander up and ask any other questions. So thanks so much. Bye, Kat. That was very nice. Yeah. Next year, you guys present. I want to watch it.
Great job, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you. Good to see you guys.
Yeah, great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
I don't think you've had the pleasure of meeting Mrs. another
No, but I watched him facilitate the venture funding panel, which he did a great job of.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Where are you based out of, Jeremiah?
So DC.
You're in DC. Okay, yeah.
I mean, our home office is in DC. We've never had a
Yeah.
office anywhere.
Yeah.
We have folks who are remote and some of the
Perfect.
colleagues here. Yeah.
No, I'm impressed with the firm, and I knew you guys from, hi Courtney, thanks for coming. Endo Pharmaceuticals was, they acquired my prior company, and they use Stern Kessler for everything. But we've used Cooley to prosecute our patents, but I think, as we start thinking more about how would you break these and, defending us, I think we'll definitely reach out to you guys and impressed with the firm.
Yeah, I heard you were in-house to Davey.
Yes.
Yeah, it's great.
Very impressive.
Breaking patents, because that's what she's done.
Yeah, no, and she's super smart, I could tell. So yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks for coming.
Hey, great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. All right.
Yeah, we should do dinner sometime. A lot of the folks seem to visit Connecticut quite often.
When you've got them here, let us know. Happy to do that. Yeah, that would be great. Okay, nice to meet you.
Hi.
Hi, Rosalia. How are you?
Good. Nice to meet you. Thanks for the presentation. I just have, in terms of the data read, do you think it will come at an industry event, or it's something that the...
Oh, no, it's big enough. We'll put out a press release on it. Yeah. I'll have all our investors and analysts nipping at our heels for it. So, yeah.
Okay, that's, and then I know your chief commercial officer kind of put up all the data in terms of the market opportunity. When you think about the market opportunity, is that, all these numbers are coming from, prescription data, or is this, I can assume it's probably, we don't have a large, group of pulmonologists that you go to, but, and when you think about maybe even patients that are undiagnosed in terms of, how the opportunity could extend, or, it's like getting a nose bleed. Well, there's nothing wrong with it.
Right, and then when you have something for it, particularly a refractory chronic cough, I think IPF most people know because they're so sick, but I think you're right, in the RCC market they'll come out. So, you basically take what's sort of published, and, Farrell showed you some data where they polled 1,000 patients and 100 pulmonologists, and you try to triangulate numbers, but you're right, I think, and that's where work will be so helpful in this space.
And would you initially go to the pulmonologist, or you would go to the family doctor who sees the patients at first?
So there's two pathways. If it's Trevi commercializing, we're probably going to pulmonologists because we're a small company. We'll want to maintain a targeted sales force. Bellis, we didn't mention this in the presentation, the other P2X3 just got acquired by Glaxo for $2 billion. So if you're Glaxo, you're going to primary care and pulmonologists because you've got big sales forces there already.
Right.
So I think it depends on who's sort of commercializing the drugs.
And so you would be expecting a lot more, clarity in terms of direction once this whole Merck stuff.
I think for us, we are going to run the company and build it as if we're going to go all the way and we're taking this to pulmonologists. I think what happens in biotech a lot, as you well know, is when you get good enough data and sort of things are de-risked, companies buy it, then they may take it a different commercial direction.
And then, for the, I'm sure you've spoken to a lot of KOLs in terms of, your product. And usually a lot of these specialists, there's always a switching cost associated with switching their patients, to it, and you need to get tremendous buy-in. I guess my first question is that, do you have sales force already educating pulmonologists in terms of, the potential of the drug, and or are you talking to, pulmonologists directly just in terms of KOL to get their buy-in?
Yeah. So in our business, you can't have sales reps on the ground before you have an approved drug, but you use a group called Medical Affairs. And so we are very active at all these medical conferences. I mean, we mentioned ATS, American Thoracic Society. Our data was presented 4 or 5 times at that conference. It's how we know people like this are paying attention to us. So we are out, we're active. I mean, I'm traveling this whole month. So, we do a lot of that through our medical affairs, but you are still a science experiment. So you have to be careful. You can't promote your drug. You have to sort of talk about the science. But we do, we spend a lot of time out. We make sure people know who we are. Our data's out. We just got it published in, New England Journal of Medicine. So we do invest in making sure people know what we're doing.
Right. And then with the 111 million on the books, that will take you to the data readout at the end of this year?
So it takes us into 2026. That whole plan I showed you, we will complete through 2024. So it funds all of that and then gives us another sort of 12 to 18 months of runway. So we can get going on the next studies and we can sort of pick, we don't have enough funds to get all the way to approval. So there's another raise to do in here. But, we have a PN asset that we may license. So that'll bring in capital. So that's why we don't have to be in a hurry. It's nice. We can, get the data, understand our path forward, see what other deals we can do, and then decide, what's the right time to raise for the company.
And in terms of the, for example, the doctor mentioned the subjective endpoint. Does the FDA require any quality of life improvement on this? Look at the scale. They have the scale that they put on that you're supposed to be on.
In IPF, there's a specific one. I think they use it in RCC too. It's called the Leicester Quality of Life Scale. So yes, you always have to have QOL measures for exactly what Peter said. Just because our cough's down doesn't mean we feel any better or we even notice it. If my cough goes from 50 times to 30, do you really notice it? Yeah, exactly. So yes, the FDA will make us link a patient-reported outcome to that and show that the patient, which is those line charts I showed you, the patient could tell if their cough was less severe, was less frequent, they felt better, and we've got other quality of life measures.
Do you have to do a survey with the family members as well?
So there's a lot of discussion. We got into that last week. The caregivers are an excellent source of information because they said a lot of times patients don't even realize how much they cough. And so doctors will say, do you cough much? And they're like, no, I don't really cough that much. And the caregiver says, you cough all the time. Yeah, I thought that was so interesting. And they said, actually, when you poll the caregiver, you get a much better read on how much, which is always so fascinating. And we're all lawyers, right? We're always like, I'm not that sick, but the people that care about you see it. So.
It's like your husband's like, I don't snore. It's like, yeah, you do snore.
You do.
You snore for the past 30 years.
Exactly. So you run a fund?
I run a hedge fund that invests in tech, biotech, and medtech.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and so we're always looking for the next, where the puck is going to land next. And I know it's been, an area where I think once the FDA kind of, refocus again from totally COVID to start looking at other indications, then there will be a lot.
It'll be a good time. Well, good. Well, reach out if you want any more follow-up conversation, but thank you for attending.
Yeah,
really appreciate it.
All
All right, enjoy the summit.
Thank you.
Go back, when they stop the drug. But we won't know that again. It's
Okay.
There'll be people.
So good to see you. I didn't even see you back there.
I was late. We'll see.
I didn't notice.
It took me forever to find parking.
Yeah, I know. Thank you for asking.
A lot of fascinating questions still out which remain unanswered because we've got to
Which we appreciate.
those were the exact questions.
Yeah, it's good. Well, thank you. It's your time to come catch up.
I guess
How are you rolling on with everything?
No, that's not his fault.
How many pulmonologists are treating RCCs and
Yeah, I mean,
Jeff
so
Larry, is it a
there were
group of people or do they?
three health centers like mine. I mean,
But
literally
who's
single
buying it,
digit
all
in
of
the
you?
US. So vast majority of RCC patients in the United States are treated by pulmonologists. Number one. Number two, allergists. Which aren't that far below pulmonologists. It's very common when I see a patient, it only gets to me after 5 or 10 years, they've seen at least one pulmonary, at least one allergy, at least one ENT.
Oh, so you're like a
I'm happy about
chronic
that.
cough specialty.
Yes, we have, so I run the Montefiore Call Center. I mean, I'll see people early on if they know I'm around, but I get patients sent to me by other pulmonologists or other allergists. But again, less than 1% of all RCC patients are seen in cough centers because there's a few of us.
I mean,
So
that was
in
a
the
whole
US, the
crazy
vast majority of
set of
RCC and
events.
IPF are going to be seen by pulmonary. And then as far as RCC goes, it's pulmonary, then allergy, then ENT, then GI if you suspect reflux. Yeah, so most RCCs treated are treated by pulmonary doctors and allergy doctors.
I mean, that's a different side
Now,
of
the
the
first
house,
way,
but
of course,
you
is the
guys are
primary
better
care
off
physician,
without
right?
it. Although
Obviously,
with the
since
good
they're the first line of meeting a patient, the primary care docs are going to be the first doc to interact with a chronic patient.
You lived, you were like frustrated too, so.
A very busy primary care doc wants to put into this initial workup, like I said, looking at very often asthma reflex. Some more motivated primary cares do some of those steps themselves, and then they, send out for referral. And others are much more partnership with us.
Yeah, no, and you guys hung in
It's
there,
great,
no, and I
individual
never
based.
held it against you guys, because I knew what it
And then
was.
the
I
other
mean,
interesting
the
thing
short
is
time we had to
what
send
the
the
referral
message,
patterns are.
but then
Is
it was
most
going down your back.
internalists will, primary care docs will send to pulmonary, but some go to allergy as their first consult, and interestingly, others go to ENT as their first chronic cough consult.
You guys have kept your name out there, though, you've kept people,
So,
letting people know
very,
you're
very
not dead and
variable
gone.
from doc to doc.
Yeah, you've done some deals.
Okay, I very much appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Are you joining us for lunch? Yeah, good, don't leave, you're coming, where'd Leland shuffle off to?
Okay. It's gonna-
We'll let you go to the bathroom. Okay. Peter, this is Gabe Cavazos. He's a very active banker in the whole biotech space. So he's with SVB Larynx. You saw the whole SVB craze. Larynx now split off, but Gabe was one of the bankers that helped build up that whole side of things. And actually IPO'd us. They've been our bankers from the beginning. So been really great partners.
Yeah, I've seen this story evolve, and now we're
Yeah.
late stage.
Now you need to find us a Bellis kind of deal, and
No
we'll
kidding.
be all set.
Yeah, I know. Nearing commercialization.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, you were, when we were the itch company, now we've sort of pivoted.
Yes, but I mean, everyone's looking for late stage assets.
Yeah.
Clinically de-risked, meaningful market opportunities.
Yeah, we need to get through this next round of development. There's some good questions we'll answer, and then that'll sort of put us in that conversation, I think.
Sure.
And the safety study will be key as well.
Both of them. I think that human abuse liability and safety, I think those are two important questions. I'd want to know if I was buying Trevi.
Yeah, before you walked over, I've always felt like that's enough.
Yeah, I don't worry about the human abuse. I mean, you've seen the side effect profile of the drug. You're not taking a bunch of that with the beer.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's just blocking.
Yeah. It's more the respiratory depression. It's not even that we're so worried about it. It's that it's a really sophisticated study that hasn't been done. The human abuse liability is sort of tried and true, and we ended up in a good comparator, and we know those are really clear how you run them. The respiratory physiology is high science. patients. And you're in a group of patients who have a lot of impairment, you know? So, so we're trying to be really thoughtful about it, working with, you know, sort of leading edge. I mean, the data that's going to come out of that's going to be really interesting, I think. So anyway, it'll be sort of presented in a lot of different formats, but that's sort of the one, if I lay awake at night, it's not even because I particularly worry about it, it's I worry about conducting the study and getting something that people understand. Yeah. So you know, you can't be afraid of your drug. You gotta go through it. So.
Yeah, I agree.
And dose ranging should be pretty low risk. I mean, we know it works, so that's just a matter of finding the right dose.
And you can combine it with nearly everything else that's being used currently. And certainly anything peripheral you can combine it with, because there'd be no issue. Drug-to-drug interactions. Yeah. I mean, the only thing is you probably would think about combining it with another central, but given that we don't have a good central that everyone's rushing to use, it's realistically not going to be an issue. Yeah. So even for those who are responding to P2X3s, you can still potentially put it on top of.
Oh, from a safety perspective, yeah. But even, let's say, somebody who's getting a little bit of help with gabapentin, but yet they're very sedated, you're going to stop the gabapentin and try this drug as opposed to add it on. So,
Peter, do you ever envision a world, I think Gabe sort of asked this, is someone has whatever, 100 coughs and you get it down to 50, that you would try adding on our drug too if it still bothers them to the patient in conjunction, like the two of them?
Yeah, that's exactly why I come over there. You know, the P2X3s are not lights out drugs. So, yeah, I mean, it's great to help a cough 50% if it's terrible. But if it goes from terrible to less terrible, if it's still life disrupting, then you're certainly going to be looking for an add-on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's a piece of the market we haven't really sort of factored into what we're doing. It's good.
I think there are a number of slivers that could be down the road. You don't want to, for pricing, you don't want to talk too much about how big the market is.
And all your data, we've got to get through our RCC trial, hopefully put up good data and then get through that. So. Well, get ready, Gabe.
I'm ready.
You guys,
I'm ready.
next year.
Get back to the office.
Yeah. Well, it's easy for me to drive up. It was only a quick drive, so I figured I'd come say
He's
hi.
in your neck of the woods, Peter. He's in Westchester.
I'm in Rye, yeah.
Oh, okay, I live in Armonk. So
Oh, nice.
You just hop on 95.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Oh, yeah, good. Well, good luck today with everything. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I couldn't find
Thank
the
you.
garage.
Are you going back to the office? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to keep this?
Yeah,
Oh, it's got bio now.
I just put the corporate.
Yes, they did.
Oh, and so I go through and play with it for bio.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, shit, because that's like Monday.
Yeah.
we have
Oh.
Well, it's a good thing you
all
guys
over the US, but-
Sorry, it's so.
Yeah,
of course. We are not.
I'm in Boston all the time. Yeah, in Boston. Everything's supposed to go. You do.
Does that bother you? Are you thinking we need his clearance?
No, because originally we were going to use this slide.
Why?
Yeah, no problem. I was in the
He doesn't mind.
Yeah.
We can ask him if we do it without or with, but I would include them.
Can we take that too?
I think I'm good. I need to round up Leland and hopefully Leland might have, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Hopefully he's joining us for lunch, although he accepted actually.
Yes, you did.
in New York. Yeah, that's,
I'm gonna run down our two analysts. Tell Tom he was missed.
I'm gonna work out with you. I will. Oh, Tom's not here.
Yeah.
Shasha, no. Is Gabe's Tom.